Hi, welcome back. So in this video lesson, we'll talk about test design. Just to remind you, we are in the first chapter of our ISTQB Advanced Test Manager Certification course, and we are talking about test analysis and design topic of our first chapter. So test design, it starts when test conditions are identified and sufficient information is available. So in the previous phase, in the test analysis activity, we looked at the test basis and we studied it thoroughly and then created a set of test conditions, and now we are converting those test conditions to test cases. So how does it work? So you have test conditions, and these test conditions, based on them, you will design and specify test cases. And in some situations, you also develop what we call test procedures. And some situations, you may not create test procedures, but typically using test conditions, you will design and specify test cases and also develop test procedures. Now, at what level of detail I should document my test cases can be high level. The high level test cases, we call them as logical test cases, or we can create very low level test cases which are typically termed as concrete test cases. Okay, so now how do we relate test cases to test basis? So far test conditions have been related to the backward traceability we used and linked it to the plan and strategy and test policy and test objectives. Now let us look at how we can relate test cases to test basis. So let us take, we are using a specification based test strategy. So in my software I have two requirements, requirements 1 and requirement 2. Now I analyze these requirements, and during the analysis phase I identified test conditions. So I have 6 test conditions have been identified, and I traced back those test conditions to my requirements. Now then, based on these test conditions, I have built my test cases. I have created 4 test cases and again traced them back to their test conditions to their requirements. Now here in this diagram we have the test condition 1 and test condition 2 have associated test cases, but test condition 3 doesn't seem to have a test case written for it. Similarly, the test condition 6 doesn't have a test case related to that. That is possible. So you may create one or more test cases for some test conditions, or you may miss to create test cases for some test conditions. So this is what you have built. Now as a test manager, you have executed tests and you want to trace your test results back to your test conditions to requirements. So here the blue test conditions are covered by a test and the yellow test conditions are not covered by a test. Now the rest of the things are covered. So now let us look at, after executing, this is the status you have identified. So the first test case has been run and passed, and the second test case again has been run and passed. Test case 3 has been run and passed, and test case 4 has been run but it failed. So this is the status you have observed and you have linked it back. Now let us look at what is happened because the test case 1, test case 2, test case 3 have passed, because they are linked to the first 3 test conditions, the test condition 1, 2 and 4. So your requirement has been fulfilled, and all test cases that have been created have been executed and have passed. So you have 100% test coverage. But if you compute your test condition coverage, For this requirement, you have identified 4 test conditions, but you have only covered 3 test conditions. So 3 out of 4, that is 75% test condition coverage. That is how the traceability helps you to understand the consistency, completeness of your test cases back to your requirements. Now let us look at what is happening with this requirement 2. So the requirement 2, the test case 4 has been run, but it failed. It is linked to the 5th test condition, which is linked to the requirement 2. But the test condition 4, which is linked to requirement 2, has a test case and it has passed. So some amount of requirement has been fulfilled, but because the 5th test condition has failed, still your requirement 1, 2 has not been fully fulfilled. It is still outstanding. And from test completion point of view, meaning all the prepared test cases, have they been executed or not? Yes, you have executed all of them. It is not that some of the test cases are still pending. So it is 100% test completion. What is the test success for you? It is 50%, because only part of the test conditions have passed. So part of the test case only have passed. So this is how you use this information. So test design can be integrated very closely with test analysis. In some projects we do, and in some projects we separate the test analysis and test design as 2 separate activities. So for higher levels of testing, example, the system testing or acceptance testing, test design more likely a separate activity following test analysis. That is how people do that. But for lower level testing, example, component testing or component integration testing, maybe it's more likely that test analysis and design will be an integrated activity. So that is also, please keep that in mind. And also level of detail that we have to put in our test cases. So if it is a high level test case, we term it as logical test case. If you write lot of details into a test case, then we are calling it as concrete test cases. So how do we compare the pros and cons of concrete test cases versus logical test cases? So in concrete test cases, the content is all specific information and procedures required. So you will give lot of the input data and clear information about all the possible data, everything you will put it inside the test case. That's why it is very specific information and procedures are required. Whereas the logical test case, high level guideline for what is to be tested only is given. And advantage there is that tester can vary data and procedures. So data is not embedded inside your test case. So tester can use his or her creativity and vary the data and the procedure and run the logical test case in different way, whichever way they want to run. And the concrete test cases are very useful when the requirements are very well defined. And also testing staff is less experienced, because by writing they will learn about the system, and because they are not very experienced, they may not be able to vary and they may not be able to test well. So if your test staff is less experienced, better you go with concrete test cases. And also whenever there is an external verification is required, a third party looks at your test cases, then it is important that you go for concrete test cases. Whereas the logical test cases are useful when requirements are not well defined. So you have to use your intuition and build at a high level test case. And also if your testing staff is very experienced, there is no point writing very low level details in test cases, because they can manage the variation in testing. And also when you don't need to give to your clients or third parties the formal documents if they are not required, there is no need of writing concrete test cases. Logical test cases are good. So what is good point with concrete test cases? It gives you what we call reproducibility. If a tester 1 writes it and a tester 2 in another country has to run the test case, a high degree of reproducibility is there. So that is a good point. What is a good point from a logical test case point of view? It gives better coverage, and you can start working with when there is no proper documentation. So that is why early involvement of tester will be there if you attempt to write logical test cases. And what is the problem with concrete test cases? Though reproducibility is a good point there, but whenever a change occurs, you need high maintenance effort, and also it limits tester ingenuity or creativity. That is the problem with concrete test cases. Whereas in the logical test case, what is the problem? Loss of reproducibility. A very experienced tester writes and others cannot understand. So that reproducibility is an issue with logical test case. So keep that in mind when you choose between concrete test cases or logical test cases. So hope you have enjoyed this lesson. So learn and have fun.